I have prepared this message as the key message for my time at New Zealand Christian Network. Most times, if you have heard me speak, I was probably reporting on something that is happening in some part of the church somewhere in the country. After 8 years in my present position, I believe this is the right occasion to make some comment on those things and areas I think we need to focus on for the decade ahead. New Zealand Christian Network was launched under the name Vision Network of New Zealand in September 2002 and changed its name to New Zealand Christian Network at the AGM in 2008. Next year is our 10th anniversary, and I look forward to celebrating what God has done and is doing in New Zealand through the work of the network. I was a board member at the time of the launch and began serving as National Director in March 2003. In the 8 years since I started, I travelled the country extensively, met regularly with a wide range of leaders, and passed on that which I believed would be edifying to others. Many of you don't know my whakapapa, and it may help if I tell you that before I go further. I was born in Suffolk, England in 1953. Suffolk is farming country, known to many people through the paintings of John Constable. My father was in the military, my mother was an office worker. Neither of them attended church, but I was dropped off every Sunday from before I can remember. Being a military family, we moved around a lot. I lived in 25 homes and I went to 15 schools before I was 16 years old. With Church of England being the established church in England, if we lived on or near a military base, that's the church I would attend. Otherwise, it would be the nearest church, whether a Congregational, Methodist or whatever. A very ecumenical upbringing. When I came to New Zealand age 16, I dropped out of church. And apart from getting married in the Methodist church my in-laws attended when I was 28 years old, I didn't really expect to see the inside of a church ever again. My career was computer technology, my hobby was philosophy, my focus was my pleasure. By the time I was 36, my computer business was struggling, my marriage was a wreck, I was going through a bottle of whiskey every 3 days. Even though we had one son, we were quite relaxed about the prospect of separating or getting divorced. Many of our friends had already done so. At the same time, there were 2 Christians at work who would regularly try to engage me in conversations about God and Jesus. My response ranged from disinterested to antagonistic. But they planted a seed, or maybe they watered a seed that had been planted in my childhood. Even later, while sitting on my own one night in my house, God revealed himself to me. I understood instantly that God is real, Jesus is real. Jesus really had died for me. It felt like it was only for me. And he had come back to life, proving that he is God. It was a dramatic and completely unexpected conversion. The first Sunday, I nearly ran to the nearest church, which happened to be an Anglican church. My wife was sceptical whether this change would last, but 2 years later, while attending the Family Life Conference together, she committed herself as a follower to Jesus too. And we started taking our 3 sons by that time to church together. Because there were no other children at this church, and because I was away from Auckland on business a great deal, my wife moved our family to a Baptist church. I basically arrived back in Auckland one weekend and found I was a Baptist now. Meanwhile, I would be attending the nearest church to wherever I was visiting on business. I thought they were all the same. If I was in Australia, it was Pentecostal. If I was in the Pacific, it was Catholic. And if I was in New Zealand, it would be Anglican or Baptist. In 1998, I took my family to live and work in Tonga for 4 months, mainly to seek God for our future. We attended a Palangi AOG church while we were there, where my wife and I were so convicted one Sunday on the matter of baptism that we asked the AOG pastor to baptise us immediately. When we left there, I was invited to do a master's degree at a Lutheran seminary, which is where I met Sela. We graduated together, received our caps from the King of Tonga. For part of the time that I was studying, I was based in Scotland, where I attended Presbyterian or Free Church of Scotland. All of which has combined to give me an uncommon experience of the diversity in the church, and I believe a special sensitivity to God's heart for unity. I also want to say a couple of words about New Zealand Christian Network before I begin my message. New Zealand Christian Network is the New Zealand member of the World Evangelical Alliance. Jeff is my boss. We grew out of groups like the Evangelical Fellowship New Zealand in the 80s and Vision New Zealand in the 90s. Many of those leaders in those movements were involved in the formation of Vision Network New Zealand in 2002, now called New Zealand Christian Network. We affirm the historic creeds of the faith and the Bible as God's Word. At the 2005 Congress, 6 years ago, we honoured former principal of Bible College, New Zealand, Brian Hathaway, who died 2 years before that Congress. Brian and Bruce Patrick organised the first 3 Congresses in the 90s under the banner Vision New Zealand. We honoured Graham Lee at our 2008 annual general meeting. Graham was a driving force in setting up the network and served as its founding director until I started in March 2003. If Bruce Nichols is in the room, I'd also like to honour his work for the Asian Theological Association. Bruce was at one stage the theological head for the World Evangelical Fellowship. So we have some distinguished people in our midst. But today I want to especially honour another man who played a huge part in our history, John Fulford. John died just over a year ago. He was a pastor in the New Zealand Christian Churches denomination, formerly called the Association of Churches of Christ, and served 2 terms as their national leader. Even after he finished in that role, he continued to be their representative at the National Church Leaders Meetings. John also served as New Zealand Christian Network's prayer coordinator. He was passionate about prayer and evangelism. He was a great friend to me and to many of you here. If we could just have a moment's silence to remember John. Through the guidance of people like John and others too numerous to name, New Zealand Christian Network has developed as a broad spectrum network. We have on our board of reference leaders from virtually every church and denomination. We are evangelical, but we seek to serve the whole church. I would like to think that Brian McLaren's term, generous orthodoxy, describes what we do. But I am comfortable with the term evangelical. Evangelicals have some baggage, just like every part of the church. But we also do many things well. Pope Benedict talks in his latest book, Light of the World, of the major new phenomenon of the evangelicals, who are expanding with an enormous dynamism and are in the process of changing the whole religious landscape in the countries of the Third World. He is absolutely right, and I would like to think that we're making an impact on the religious landscape in other parts of the world too. When I showed these pictures at Knox College in Dunedin just before Christmas, and said, well, these are some of the people that we work with in the World Evangelical Alliance, Christine McMillan on human trafficking, Jerry Seal, Bishop Jerry Seal from the Caribbean, HIV/AIDS, and Joel Edwards, head of the Micah Challenge Network. And I talked about some of the work that we're involved in the World Evangelical Alliance. I had a number of the students at Knox come up to me afterwards and say, I didn't realise that evangelicals were involved in so many social action projects. And I said, of course. There's a caricature of evangelicals which is just not right. In New Zealand at the present time, the majority of active Christians across the whole church are evangelicals. And so to my short message. That was just the introduction. Gospel in the decade ahead. I've been fascinated by this motif of this glass for a long time. Any analysis of this kind is vulnerable to the tendency to focus on only the negative or only the positive. The fact is that in our society, as in the church, there are many aspects which are both good and bad. The glass is half full, and it is also half empty. I want to fully honour and celebrate all the good things which are good in the society and in the church. I thank God for the seed of the gospel which was planted in this country nearly 200 years ago. I thank God for the level of peace and harmony which exists in our country. I thank God we are one of the least corrupt countries in the world. I thank God for all those who work in government and charities and aid organisations and business and other spheres of society seeking to make New Zealand a better place for all. Not all of them Christians. I especially thank God for the church, and in particular leaders in the church like yourselves and others throughout the country who work to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to those who need to receive it. But like you, I feel a concern at the issues we face in our society and the church. And even though most of these comments are focused on those issues, let us not lose sight of the fact that there is much to thank God and celebrate. The decade ahead will see, starting in just over 4 weeks' time, the first post-war baby boomers reach retirement age. In New Zealand, every week from that point on, the number receiving superannuation will increase by an additional 400 people every week. And it will need the tax contribution of 800 new additional workers each week to cover that cost. The decade ahead will see a continuing difficult economic climate, the impact of which will be felt far more by the poor than by the rich. Unless something happens to change the direction we're going, the gap between rich and poor will increase even further. We will lock up more and more people in our prisons, and will continue to place an unsustainable demand on the planet's resources. The decade ahead will see growth in population numbers, including people from different religions, and a reduction in the proportion of Europeans relative to other ethnic groups. The events of the past few weeks in the Middle East indicate that a seismic shift is going on in Arab Muslim countries. But there is no clear picture yet as to what the situation will be after these pro-democracy protests achieve their immediate objective of removing their respective dictators from power. In short, the decade ahead will be a time of change and challenge, with no shortage of opportunities for a church that is centred on God and committed to being involved in what God is doing in the world. But although there are many issues in our society and the world beyond, I want to focus my comments today on what's happening in and through the church. After 8 years of talking and especially listening to pastors, ministers and leaders around this country, I believe the letter of the Church of Sardis could have been written to the Church of New Zealand today. It is a letter that is about a glass half full and a glass half empty. It contains a commendation to those who have not soiled their clothes, who are worthy. Their names will not be blotted from the book of life. Yes. And it contains a warning to those who have a reputation of being alive but are in fact dead, whose deeds are unfinished in the sight of God, who are asleep and need to wake up. This is a serious warning as it relates to people's eternal destiny. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Roughly 50% of people in this country call themselves Christian in the 2006 census, down from 90%, over 90% 100 years ago. In the next national census, as Bruce said this morning, which is only 2 weeks away, the figure may go below 50% for the first time. The drop is sad, but it says nothing about the trends of what's going on inside the church. Roughly 20%, 1 in 5 people attends church on a regular basis. Peter Lynham, a church historian from Massey University, has said 14.5 to 15% attends weekly, 18 to 19% attends 2 to 3 times a month, which he calls regular. This figure may be increasing slightly, I'm not sure. It used to be common to say that 1 in 10 attends church regularly, but Peter corrected that figure at the 2005 Congress. What is more of a concern, though, is that only a small proportion of those who attend church regularly seem to have a faith which reflects an understanding of and involvement in the mission of God. In my first few months in this job, as I travelled around meeting pastors and ministers from every denomination, one of the questions I used to ask is, what are your main challenges as a local church leader? The most common response I got was mobilising the laity. Whether this was because people weren't aware of our calling to engage with God and His work in the world, or they didn't care, or they were too busy with other things, or whether it was a failure of leadership, or something else, I'm not exactly sure. Certainly there are challenges as leaders that we have to accept. And even Bill Hybels, who many of you will know, was reported in this book, Reveal, very humbly admitting failures in his own leadership. Some of the stuff that we've put millions of dollars into thinking it would really help our people grow and develop spiritually, when the data came back, it wasn't helping people that much. Other things that we didn't put that much money into and didn't put much staff in against, stuff our people are crying out for. We made a mistake. What we should have done when people crossed the line of faith and became Christians, we should have started telling people and teaching people that they have to take responsibility to become self-feeders. We should have gotten people, taught people how to read their Bible between services, how to do the spiritual practices much more and aggressively on their own.